Hello and welcome back to another All for Wofo show. And today we're going to be tackling some tough topics in the fixture congestion and scheduling and all that comes along with it in women's football. We've had comments from Jonas Eidebel, we've had comments from Viviana Miedemar, and to some extent they're agreeing. So it must be a big topic because that's not going to happen very often. So without further ado, we will get into it. Yes, hello, welcome back everyone, and delighted to say we have Freddie, Cardy and Beth McCowen alongside us. Beth, welcome back, how are you?
Hello, thank you for having me. I am good, how are you?
Yeah, brilliant. Looking forward to the show. I'm actually really excited about getting into the different topics around this and hearing everyone's opinions and also from the chat, so make sure people are throwing in opinions there as well. Freddie, lovely to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Yeah, really well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Should be a good discussion away from some of the stuff on the pitch, which as an Arsenal fan is probably quite appreciated after this weekend.
Yeah, no, as an Arsenal fan myself as well, I can completely agree with those comments. But yeah, we'll get into it. And I guess the immediate issue here is the kind of, I'm not sure if there are comments coming in, because usually there are at this point, but I can't actually see them. So I don't know if there's an issue with my StreamYard, but I'm going to try and fix that. But just a heads up, I'm not ignoring anyone if there are comments. And if there aren't, please do put them in. But I will try and get that sorted. Yeah, but I know we do have a comment, but that is quite... So here we go. Hi, Trebuchet. Thank you for putting me out of my misery. And Sean as well. Not seen a better trio since Messi, Suarez, and Neymar. And yeah, I wouldn't disagree there, to be honest. Let's see if we have the same firepower when we get into these debates. But okay, so yeah, getting into the fixture scheduling, we obviously saw this weekend, the kind of Chelsea and Manchester United was cancelled or postponed, shall we say. And then we also saw Arsenal and Manchester City in action. They have midweek fixtures, and Arsenal, I know the stat for that one is like a ridiculous 5 games in a very, very short period of time. And I'm sure one of you can clarify on that one. But I guess, yeah, I think the first thing is, what does this kind of say about the organisation of the WPLL? What are the issues surrounding this? How do we feel about it? That's it, Shane Thomas, thank you. 5 games in 15 days, which is just, it feels too much. And we're going to come on to some of the wider debates around this. But this first weekend and the kind of issues associated with it just feel a bit silly, and the fact that we've had to postpone a fixture already. Freddie, how does that make you feel about, I guess, the state of the league and the new management and just frustrations generally as a fan and a journalist?
Yeah, it's a worrying precedent, I think, in not just women's football but world football as a whole, that we're seeing games called off for player welfare. I think even more so in the WSL. We look at it in the Premier League and sort of men's football, as much as I don't want to bring that in, but of course we're having similar conversations in the men's and the women's game. But with the WSL and 12 teams, and obviously the Women's Champions League, which is yet to expand like the men's one has, we actually still don't really know what the future of that looks like, apart from we're going to the league phase. But it feels like a position we shouldn't have got ourselves into. We know, as much as we can be annoyed at UEFA, and maybe they could budge a little bit more in terms of having teams from the same country playing on similar nights, especially now we've got 3 in from the WSL, which, as Jonas Eidebel said, is a great achievement. It's something that as a league, we need to be celebrating instead of it being something that causes problems. It is something that, we should have seen coming. We've had a long time to look at the calendar, look at the UEFA calendar. We already know what next season's UEFA calendar in terms of qualifying is going to look like. So as much as we can be annoyed at UEFA, we know exactly or roughly what the dates are and what the UEFA rules are as well, because they're very tight with their rules. We know what we're going to get from them, and they're available to everyone, for everyone to look at. Obviously, the WPLL is new in this summer. We're not privy to the behind the scenes stuff that goes on there. And what they get into in terms of their awareness for the Champions League. This could have been a completely rookie error, if you like, or this could have been something where they actually thought we're going to try and push back on UEFA. We're trying to have our own way, and it's obviously not panned out that way. But for a game to be postponed for player welfare, look, I'm glad it has for the players' sake, but it's really worrying to see that, I think, as a fan of football, especially when it's a top quality WSL game.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with a lot of that, and I guess we've had a few comments about it being like a normal schedule for Chelsea in March, and I guess that comes down to potentially progression in tournaments. And when you see that later in the season, it's perhaps more understandable that you're going to get the teams that have done well in all competitions, because that is quite a unique, I guess, performance. And we're wanting to see. We want to see the Champions League participation being less unique in the league, hopefully, going forward. But Beth, I guess, do we think it's unfair, or is it just kind of unlucky? Obviously, Chelsea now have longer to prepare for some fixtures than others, and it's kind of this imbalance, but also potentially it is just unlucky how that's fallen, and there's not much the league can do. How do you kind of see that situation? And I guess as well, this kind of, well, Chelsea have to deal with it every year. Do teams just need to be able to accommodate that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with everything you've both said so far. I think there is an element of, oh, it's unlucky, but it's also avoidable. So I don't know if kind of saying it's unlucky, I don't know how helpful that is when as someone has pointed out in the comments, France didn't have this problem when they had 3 leagues in the Champions League last year. So as much as sometimes these things do happen, like you said, we expect that to maybe be later on in the season, not at this early stage. And if it can be avoided, which in this instance, we know that it very well could have been, then they should be. I just think it's ultimately, if we're the only, and by we, I mean the English League, the WSL, the only league that has had this issue, then it's kind of like the fault of the organisation running that league or the league itself. So I think that kind of is a bit of a wake-up call, and I appreciate that once this sort of thing happens, you can't just turn back time and undo the mistake. That's not how it works, but there are a lot of intricacies that then need to be talked about, and we do need to make sure it doesn't happen again, because it's just not good for anyone. It's not good for fans, it's not good for clubs, it's not good for the league. It's just, there's very few positives, but there are also conversations to be had about, does it put certain teams at an advantage or a disadvantage that maybe they shouldn't have been, which I think Jonas Eidefeld made some really good comments about, so I'm sure we'll talk about that further a bit later. But yeah, I think I appreciate that the scheduling isn't easy and there's a lot that needs to be considered, but especially at this point in the season, you don't expect there to be kind of blunders like this that result in a whole game having to be completely rescheduled. And there's always going to be elements when it comes to calendars and stuff that aren't necessarily fair per se, but that's just the way it goes. And I think we see that later on in the season when it comes to like prioritization maybe of teams that progress in the Champions League and things like that. But at that point, I think there's an argument for it being inevitable or it being justified, but I don't think that argument really stands at this stage.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And we've had a comment as well from Connor that I just wanted to highlight in terms of the knock-on impact as well, in terms of when this fixture is going to be rescheduled, potentially March, April. And obviously, when it comes around to that, there's going to be, I'm sure this talk will kind of reignite whether that's an issue for those teams, whether they have more. But I think it also touches on the fact that United have kind of potentially suffered, potentially benefited, not really the point, but other teams in the league, other than Chelsea, City and Arsenal, I think there's two sides to the debate of, do we need to prioritise teams that are in the Champions League to increase that coefficient? It makes us look great if we do well in Europe, and it increases the reputation of the league to get better players overall, blah, blah, blah. There's those factors. But then there's also we don't want to prioritise those teams above other teams in the league who it might be to the detriment of. I just wondered, like, either of you to jump in on this one if you had any strong feelings, but do you have an opinion on whether we should prioritise those teams that are in the Champions League, or whether that is actually unfair to then the other teams in the league?
I think the WSL need to really decide and be quite strong in actually, yes, we are, because you look at the other leagues who have for years, most other countries in Europe, put aside schedules. They make sure that teams who have, European competitions, as I said as well, men's or women's, it seems like an English problem that we don't want. We've always had that debate as well, don't we? In terms of as a supporter of one English club, do we want other English clubs in the Champions League to do well? Sometimes in other countries, fans are a little bit more liberal with that, and they do want their own sort of their own teams to go through. But I think the WSL really needs to come out strongly and say, actually, we are going to support these teams, because it's only a good thing. If you see teams in England win the Champions League, you're going to bring more players over, bring more revenue over, bring more eyes to the game, bring more attendances. You look at when Arsenal last got to the semi-final of the Champions League, that's when they got their first Emirates sellout. And you could question whether they'd have done the same in the WSL in terms of a game of that standing and what it meant to those Arsenal fans and the league as a whole. So it does strike me, as Jonas Eidevall said, England are the only country that don't seem to move things, in one way for their teams. And then you've got to wonder why not? Why do we not want English clubs to go on and have success in the Champions League? I can say as an Arsenal fan, I want Chelsea to lose tomorrow night. I want them to lose all their group games. Of course we all do. But if I'm in charge of the WSL, I want Chelsea, Arsenal, City to be right there at the end of the competition. And of course we should help them. We shouldn't help them without discrediting the other teams, because of course we've got 9 other teams in the league, but there are other ways of doing this. And even you look at those Scandinavian teams who, they finish their season in November and they have to then go on and have no league football at all, but still play Champions League. So other leagues have got their own problems and they're able to manage it. So we've got to do the same.
Yeah, no, it's really well said. And we've had a few kind of, I think, similar comments. Sean's also made the point that the WPLL are potentially only interested in how the game looks to the casuals. And I think there's a whole other issue for another day, but I think it certainly plays into this debate of potentially comments we've heard from Nikki Doucet in pre-season in terms of her management of the WPLL and this mention of like the Taylor Swift fans demographic, etc., and potentially a worrying sign. But yeah, Sean again saying Europe openly accommodate. I guess the flip side to that is potentially it's easier for those to give a bit of balance. I guess it is in some ways easier for those leagues to do that because you're accommodating for Lyon and PSG, who the league is basically between already. And if you're accommodating for Barcelona or potentially Real Madrid, again, it's basically between those teams anyway. And then I guess it is more so this year. Manchester United fans might disagree with me on this, that those 3 teams potentially are in that race. But if you're prioritising Chelsea last year, you've also got 2 very strong teams in Manchester City and Arsenal that potentially well, come on, help us out as well a little bit here. But no, I think that's really interesting. And I think we'll move on to kind of, I guess, the reason that Jonas Eidevall was making his comments is, of course, that Arsenal were being particularly affected. We saw a bit of potentially lethargy in Arsenal's squad on Sunday, although I don't think you can necessarily blame it on that because the congestion hasn't hit yet. But I think if we see that the kind of lethargy is already hitting potentially a mentality difference, do you think that this will have, and I think it feeds into some of Miedemar's comments about seeing the best football, will these kind of congestions have an impact on the quality of football that we're going to see? Either of you can go on this one.
I'll jump in. I think they will, and I think it's a difficult one. It's hard to strike that balance between at certain points in the year, the schedule does get difficult and it does get busy. However, I do understand as the Arsenal manager, when you're seeing almost your direct rivals get their game moved, I understand why you would not be happy about it. And I also just think that even taking Arsenal completely out of the equation, even taking Chelsea out of the equation, just all of the general comments that he made about the situation, I think were made some really valid and really good points. And I do think that might have gotten a bit lost because it was coming from him and you assume that he has an agenda because of his role. I think that he made some really good points and I would encourage people to kind of have a look at what he said and have a think about it separately from Arsenal. But yeah, it's a really difficult one, and I do think though that Arsenal, obviously, like if we're looking at the weekend's performance, I don't know how much any of this has to do with that. But just more generally, I didn't disagree with anything that Jonas Eidevall said. To be honest, I thought that he made some really good, really sensible points. And the league and the organisation do need to support the teams that are progressing in European football. However, I do think all the points Freddie made just now were like so great, and I completely agree. But I do think if we go too far that way, then we do run the risk of becoming like the Spanish league or the French league, where it's a 2-3 horse race. And I know you can argue that to an extent it's like that here, but not to the same degree as it is in other leagues. So it's complicated, and there's a lot to say about all of it. But yeah, I think I unfortunately don't have a solution as such. But
yeah, on Jonas as well, I think it's, I've got the quotes in front of me, and it's not, whining excuses about Arsenal. It really isn't. It's someone who is actually, he could easily use that to make an excuse for Arsenal, but in the way he's done it is saying actually the other two teams who are in, and whoever it is in future, we need to have more support from the WSL, and he's got the facts in front of him to back it up in terms of that 13 of the 16 teams are not playing on the Sunday before the midweek. And again, we go back to the fact we've had dates for a long time. I know the Australia postseason friendly, rightly controversial, rightly was mentioned, but the commercial benefits of that, as much as I hate saying that, it pains me to say it, Jonas is not going to turn around to the club and say, no way, we're not going, when there's so much of a commercial benefit for Arsenal to go out to Australia. Same in America for the preseason tour. It really boosted sort of the fan base side of thing, and it really helped the club actually to think, there's a future in here in terms of preseason tours. Of course, that's hectic, going a week after the end of the season, but they did leave a lot of players at home. The team that went out there the team that played against the A-League also was mostly younger players who benefited hugely, and I think we've really seen how the young players have come in preseason as well. So we have seen the benefit for that for Arsenal, and I think it's good to see that there's some of these sort of pre-season options are there. And also Arsenal needed these pre-season friendlies because they didn't have them last year, and then they were obviously knocked out in the Champions League qualifying. So I think we've got to be balanced there, and we've got to be balanced with Jonas and actually think, let's take the quotes as they are. Of course, have a degree of skepticism. He might well return to them on Sunday or touch it on it tomorrow in the Bayern Munich press conference. But I think we do, as fans, we need to get together a little bit as a league instead of, pointing fingers at each other.
No, really well said. Sorry, I was faffing during that to try and get this banner of the quotes up if anyone does want to read them from Jonas Eidevall. It's not the easiest way to do it, but they are there, and yeah, well worth a read if you just a quick Google search can also provide them much more easily. We've had a few contrasting comments, I guess, on this particular topic in terms of, I guess, criticism of Jonas Eidevall, which is potentially slightly unrelated in terms of Jonas having problems of his own making. I think we can all agree that that is definitely true to some extent. And Sean also making the point that City manage fine with rotation, which I'd agree with, but I'd also say that they're potentially playing pretty boring football at the moment in terms of it's not, they're playing a West Ham side, and we've seen that scoreline be 6-2 before, and it's just kind of a 2-0 with no real flair, I guess. And whether that's because of the scheduling or not, it's hard to say, but there is obviously a lot of rotation going on there, which can lead to those different performances, not necessarily better or worse, but not necessarily reflecting on like the results, but just kind of what kind of football we're getting to see as a result of such a big rotation that's necessary. But yeah, kind of scheduling these matches, I think there's a unanimous kind of agreement that's something that needs to change. And I think we'll come on now as well we've had the comments from Eidevall and those very valid points, but we've also had some comments from Viviana Miedemar in an article with Catherine Batt at the Daily Mail, talking, I guess, more about mental health aspects, and obviously she suffered the ACL and those aspects. And I don't think it's actually being talked about as much now. but we're seeing weekly in the WSL, but also across leagues, a new ACL injury, which is just horrific. And I don't know the actual stats on this, so I could be, but my perception is that there's actually even more happening now than even last season. It feels like, and obviously congestion isn't going to help. Are we going to see any improvement in this anytime soon, or is it only going to get worse? And I don't know, like it's hard to kind of come up with solutions, but yeah, like I guess, Beth, do you think we're just going to see more and more injuries if we don't kind of really make some changes in how women's football and really look at what's going wrong in this?
Yeah, I think so, unfortunately. I think there's a lot of factors, and with ACLs, I think it's important that we don't like oversimplify it, because I think scheduling is a factor. There's so many other factors as well. And we know, I guess, potentially as well as we can almost, the impact that that sort of injury has on a player, both physically, mentally, career-wise. And I know that Beth Mead and Viviana Miedema have both touched on kind of how their emotional well-being was before they did their ACLs and how that potentially played a part in the injury, which is a really interesting conversation and really important, because it's just a prime example of how many contributing factors there are to these injuries. And that's why, as Sean's pointing out in the comments, this research is so needed. I also think there's an element of it being like a generational thing. Maybe how much does the conditioning and stuff differ coming up through the age groups, for example, like in the men's game versus the women's game? Maybe that's something that's changing and improving now. But when you look back at when these players like Leah Williamson, etc., were all kind of coming up through the ranks, how different was it? Because of course we do see ACLs in the men's game probably too regularly as well, but it does, I completely agree, feel at the moment like it's not slowing down at all in the women's game. If anything, it's getting more frequent. And yeah, it's great to keep talking about it, but we are going to need even more research and even more action to try and make a change. We saw even before the WSL season started, championship players like Mia Ross did hers, young, really talented player, now sidelined for absolutely ages. And Rianne Skinner said, obviously, with Jessu being out for West Ham with her second ACL, before the season had even started, said in her first pre-match press conference that the calendar is really putting players' health at risk. So if we've got a WSL manager saying that, it does start to feel like, okay, what is being done? What's changing? Because we seem to be having the same conversation over and over again.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, I mean, I've got a bit of a list here. This is not the most kind of, my source for this is Fantasy WSL, where they put the injuries. So do excuse me if I missed anyone from this, but currently out in the WSL, this is Sam Kerr with an ACL, Sam Kerr, Vic Palova, Mia Fischel, Aurora Galli, Sophie Ingle, Kit Graham, Risa Shimizu, Elise Hughes, Emma Gabaro, Jessu, Georgia Fox, Anik Neuven. Sorry, a lot of names there. But yeah, I think I completely agree with what you said. And obviously, I think you were there on Sunday. Sophie Lundgaard rumoured to have done her ACL, which is at least one per weekend in the WSL. I'm also thinking in terms of like the summers that we've had off since, I guess, COVID from women's football's perspective. Obviously, potentially this summer a little bit more because not as many people competing in the Olympics, but still a sizable amount of women's football players are in that tournament as well. Freddie, how much do you think the international schedule plays into these problems and how intense we've seen that with no summers off for the schedule? And is that something that potentially needs to be considered?
It has to be. And we've got to have some sort of global cooperation between the governing bodies as well, because we're going to end up where we are in the men's game in terms of FIFA and UEFA and the domestic leagues just fighting for as much football as possible. And that is where the women's game is going to be a bit of a victim of its own success. And actually, this is a really, really pivotal time now. And actually, we don't want it to go down that road, because as you say, it all goes back to that player welfare conversation. It just feels like nothing's been done. It feels like we're sitting back and we're watching really, really powerlessly. And, you know, of course, we can do all the research we like and we can improve things, and these injuries are still going to happen. But it feels like nothing at the moment is being done. You know, there are long-term projects going on, but all the while that goes on, you know, players keep doing these injuries. You look at it with Everton, 2 already. And of course, people like Sam Kerr, going back to Leah Williamson, Miedema, they're going to get more focus. But as Beth said, for those players lower down the tiers, it is so difficult, you know, for that lack of maybe support you're going to get from a club who've got, you know, less money than some of the top clubs, maybe worse facilities, worse medical teams, perhaps in terms of numbers to look after you. The mental side is absolutely huge. Some of the players I've spoken to, you know, some of them come out so much more resilient because it's a, you know, you have to fight your way through, or it's such a difficult thing to come back from. And I actually think, you know, we need to look at the mental side as well, because these injuries are going to happen. They're more likely to happen for women's players. So we've just got, I think we need to see more concrete things in place that are going to say, one, this is what we're doing about it, and 2, this is how we're helping the players and the clubs about what's going on, because we all feel just helpless at the moment. And every time a player goes down in pain and it looks like a knee injury, we just fear the worst every time, and more it feels like that's coming true. And it's just it's really not it's one of the worst parts about the women's game at the moment, isn't it? And when you go to games regularly and when you watch them, and when you hear about these injuries, and they're such key players, and something's got to be done. We know it's difficult, as we say, but we just want to see a bit more concrete progress.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree with that. I had a question and it's escaped me, but I think broadly it's we've got some comments as well. Shane's kind of talking about the heads of FIFA and UEFA disliking each other and therefore not really willing to try and find a solution, and some players having to crowdfund for surgery, which kind of brings us to the next point in terms of, we touched on it, but we have seen like Miedema, Mateus, and these high-profile footballers get ACLs, and that's been covered huge. And I think we saw more press attention when there was those high-profile names. Potentially, understandably, it draws clicks. That's how the media works, for better or for worse. But now we are seeing, I guess, as Beth mentioned, players in the Championship, and Shane talking about crowdfunding. Do we think that the focus has moved away and it's kind of tailing off in a way that's going to negatively impact the kind of impetus to do research? I know Project ACL is kind of in the pipeline, but how much impact it will have. Do we need to have some kind of, I don't know, a better groundswell even from fans or players to keep this pressure on in terms of making progress? Because I do feel like it's kind of been a news story and dropped away. And how do we kind of maintain that pressure? Beth, will come to you on this one.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And like you said, it's understandable that when one of the biggest names in the league suffers an ACL injury, of course, that's something that makes headlines, and maybe it doesn't so much when it's a slightly lesser known player or a player playing in a lower tier. However, that would be less of an issue if those players then received the same support. But when they don't get the media attention, and then they perhaps because of that, or whether it's a separate issue, don't get the same support psychologically or with their recovery, etc., that then it is even more of a problem. And it's difficult to combat that, especially when, like, we talk all the time about the gap between the WSL and the Championship, and even the top of the table in the WSL and lower down the table. So I wonder if I don't know how much pressure clubs have historically put on the kind of wider bodies to look at this issue. Maybe that's something that needs to be considered. I think us all as media having these conversations is really important, continuing to draw it to people's attentions and say, you know, just because you're not hearing about it as much, it hasn't gone away. It's still happening very much. And I think there's been a lot of players who've done a really great job at kind of like championing the idea of working towards change when it comes to these injuries and how they maybe affect female players differently or happen to female players more frequently. But yeah, it's almost as if we need some sort of initiative that's gonna be the catalyst for a change, because so far, yes, we are seeing the research and we're seeing conversations maybe fizzle out a little bit as of late. But how do we get the league and the WPLL and UEFA and all of these bodies to really act? And I appreciate they might not have the answers just yet as to how to act, but how do we push them to get them sooner? I think it's almost like that needs some sort of, not even just league-wide, but kind of countrywide, nationwide, whatever campaign, which is really difficult to facilitate, and it obviously impacts different people in different clubs and different leagues even really differently. So yeah, it's really hard to know how to handle that. I wish I had a solution, but yeah, definitely need to keep the conversations going first and foremost, and put pressure for this research to be carried out like sooner rather than later.
It's interesting on the media side, actually, because you look at the injuries and obviously there's all the press, is it an ACL? Normally we find out sort of a few days later, and then we almost say, this is awful. And then we straight away talk about who's going to replace her in midfield or whatever. And then we forget about the player for months and months until she comes back. And then it's all the positive press and, she's back in training. She comes back on. We have the video of all the fans cheering. It's normally quite emotional for the player. It's almost such a long injury that we sort of cast the player aside, I find, in the media sometimes. And it's obviously really hard because we're not privy to their recovery. Miedema were really good with that, actually. And I really liked how they had the Arsenal film crew in, and they were saying this is what we've got to go through. They sort of showcase some of the ups and downs, but again, we're not going to see that with lower clubs sometimes, and players aren't going to do that. Some players are going to want to recover, quite privately and away from sort of the glare of the media. But it does come back as well, to the high profile players and how the media, how sort of balanced it is in terms of its coverage of the WSL. It is quite heavy, quite top heavy. Sorry, those lower teams, not. We look at the championship as itself, but even just sort of the bottom half of the WSL, how often do we see a Leicester versus Crystal Palace on TV? Nowhere near enough. When the TV picks are announced, it's one of the top four, two or three of the top four every single weekend. And sometimes we're denied sort of that opportunity to watch some of the lower sides in the WSL, and of which the quality is getting better and better. And that means when we see these negative stories come out, whether they be ACL, whether they be players, not having wages paid or financial issues at the club, there is, less media coverage. And that's something that we do need to look at, but it's something that's not going to happen overnight, because we know that the Arsenal, Cities, Uniteds, Chelsea's, of course, we know they're going to get the media coverage. So almost at the moment, it feels like almost down to the individual clubs and the players almost to say, we need some help over here. But when they are in that recovery, that's their number one focus. And it takes quite a strong-hearted player to almost be in that recovery and say, you know what, I'm going to try and do something about this. I'm going to try and help people out. And, we look at how relentless the schedule is. Players don't have a moment, to turn around and say, we're going to try and sort something out. We're going to try and complain to UEFA. But that's when it all goes back to the scheduling issues. And in terms of actually when managers say, we're not happy with this, it's not 100% because they want that competitive advantage or feel they're being hard done by. There's going to be stuff in there that they're not saying. They're not going to say, we're really worried about this busy week because we think our players are going to get injured, because you're never going to publicly say that. But we know what we do know now roughly is the factors behind the injuries. And one of them is playing so much football, and nothing at the moment is being done about that. So we've got to look more into the factors. Of course, the study is going to go in, show us a few more specifics in a way, but we know enough now to start making progress. And at the moment, it's not really happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's also quite interesting that we kind of hear these. I think we've heard a lot of different reasons for why ACLs happen. We've heard it's happening more in the women's game because of women's body shape. It's happening more because of fixtures and all these different explanations. And I just think that there's also this kind of point, I think it came up in the chat at some point, that, yeah, Trebuchet talking like you need longitudinal studies and that will take years. But it's almost like we've had this perception of an inevitability that this generation are just going to have ACL injuries and that's going to happen until we get this research. But it almost feels wrong to settle for that and to accept that that's just going to happen because they haven't had the training in their youth, they haven't had the conditioning in their youth. And to me, that just doesn't sit quite right, that we're just so willing to kind of accept that it's going to take 10 years to get some answers. And by that point, it'll be too late for a whole generation. We did, of course, have the good news that Jill Roord is back. She started at the weekend, which is brilliant. And it kind of speaks into Freddie's point that don't really hear much about her until the kind of and I think that brings us on. I'm also just going to address this because I have been receiving a bit of stick in the comments for saying that City play boring football. My point wasn't that City play boring football and that's bad. It was more the fact that there's an intense schedule and it might force more boring matches. It's not specifically City. I know Arsenal played absolutely terribly. I'm fully aware of that. And it wasn't any kind of point against a particular team. But yeah, to move us on to the kind of mental health aspect, and we've heard this from Viviana Miedemar in her article, and I'm just going to put up the banner of her quotes if you want to have a quick scan of them, but you can find them in the Daily Mail article as well. And Beth touched on it in terms of, and I think Freddie too, in terms of the mental health aspect of when you're away from these injuries, but also Beth and Viv both talking about how they were in a poor mental state when they did their ACL, and the kind of mental fatigue that comes along with having so many fixtures back to back, and how that's going to impact players, because we saw this fixture postponed for a player welfare perspective, but surely a congested schedule is always going to have a kind of player welfare element to it. And I guess a general question is just, do we hear enough about that? Because we don't often speak about mental health in the game, about player welfare. And actually these issues really do feed into that. And yeah, I just wondered whether you two had any, I guess, general thoughts on that, and then maybe we can dig a bit deeper.
I think one thing that struck me is actually, are we almost looking at the young girls coming through academies and then seeing, 8, 9 months? I mean, I interviewed a player this summer, and I'll try not to go on about this for too long, but she was out. She did her ACL the day before her 15th birthday. So she's now got a scholarship after leaving Arsenal's academy. Did her ACL the day before she turned 15. She was out for 522 days. And that's at the age of 15, when you've got school and everything else on, or the college, I think they have in the Arsenal academy. And she had to drive an hour and a half to spend just some time with her teammates, almost watch them train, use some of the Arsenal facilities. And almost, she told me she sort of, her ACD almost meant when she got told to do, 6 minutes of something, she's going to do 7. And it really pushed her on with the recovery. But I thought there's absolutely no way, if I was, or many of us were in that situation, 522 days when she was on the fringe of sort of England youth squads, and that maybe hasn't quite materialized for her, and she's gone over to the US. But as a younger player, that's quite traumatizing, I think, in your career, to be out for that long and actually try and not throw the towel in and say, I'm going to go and do something else. And I think we need to have this duty of care for both them, because there's a lot, this does happen in academies. I'm aware of academy players who've done their ACL twice, before even looking at senior football. So it's at all levels of the game, And obviously some clubs are going to have better help, physical and mental. We are seeing more psychologists sort of in the WSL and at different clubs. But what we don't want to do is put off girls from playing football and saying, actually, there is this epidemic. Words like that, are right to be used in the women's game. And that's almost a sign of where we are now. But I think it is, massive credit to Viv. Every time she's almost speaks monthly, really, or weekly about her mental health, how she's feeling. And there aren't many of people who are brave enough to do that in society, let alone football, which has so many sort of taboos. And I'm really, really grateful for that. I think to see a role model like her come out and speak about it, be so honest, even when she came back to Arsenal with City, and she basically said, I've never been more nervous for a game in my life. And Gareth Taylor spoke about that as well. And that's really important. And I hope that'll encourage more players to speak out. And Viv's been doing that long before the ACL as well. So credit to her. But, something like that, you have to be mentally strong, more than physical, in my view, to come back from an injury and to get back out on the pitch as well, to go back out to the pitch where maybe you did that injury, or to get into sort of physical positions where actually this could hurt me. And we've obviously never done it, I don't think any of us, but we can only imagine how difficult all those various stages are.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess even away from, I think what you said about Miedema is super important, and how well she speaks on it, and having more and more of those role models. I know Katie Startup, who's just signed for City as well, she wears, I think it's the number 40 for mental health awareness, and to try and talk about that a bit more. And seeing more and more players do that. Obviously, they don't have any kind of obligation to do that, but the players that do that is really important. I think this is quite an interesting thing to touch on, is Daniel Graham saying, ironically, Viv did hers after a short break. But I think the point that I want to take away from that is the fact that we see a lot of players have time off for an injury and a physical injury, but we don't see a lot of players have time off for mental welfare. And that was actually quite a big thing for Viv to have time off at that point for a kind of, I guess, mental well-being. And Trebuchet kind of saying she was playing quite well after that sabbatical, and obviously it's now come to light that she essentially wasn't still in a good place when she did that ACL injury. But the fact that she felt okay to take that, do we think that maybe with all this scheduling, I guess there's two aspects to this, that A, clubs should allow that more, but B, the scheduling again makes that even harder for players to kind of come out and say, actually, I need some time off, because it's putting more pressure on the rest of the squad. Beth, what would your thoughts be in terms of the need for that a bit more and pressures?
Yeah, definitely. Of course, I think anyone in any profession should be able to say when they're struggling with their mental health, and if they need time off or need support, need treatment, whatever it may be. But I think it's really in relation to this conversation that we're having. So it's also connected, like fixture lists, the impact on fatigue, the impact of fatigue on mental health, the impact of mental health on fatigue, and then ACL injuries and recovery, and how all of those things affect each other. So you really, I don't think you can tackle any of these issues without dealing with all of them. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. So it's like when it comes to something like mental health, or also scheduling and the ACL epidemic, there has to be this like multifaceted approach. And that's why I think, as we were saying, we need maybe clubs or whoever it might be to really kind of keep pushing for that change, because it's also interlinked. And I think we've seen players like Viv kind of document that and sum that up really nicely. And if that's one player who's kind of like sharing their experience, how many other players have had that experience, but they just haven't felt comfortable sharing or haven't had the opportunity to share it? And also just touching on what Freddie said about the academy player, it's such a big thing anyway within women's sport more generally, I think, of girls getting kind of going through their teenage years, and that's when they stop playing for whatever reason that might be, before they kind of make that breakthrough to the more senior level. They stop playing regardless of whether they could have been the best player in the world when they got a bit older or not. And I think when you add something that, as anyone, I think any athlete, especially as a young person, is quite scary, the thought of in such a long-term injury like an ACL, or kind of the correlation between your work and your game and your mental health. It's not gonna reassure young players, I don't think, at the moment, to kind of keep going. And I think we want to show young athletes that things are getting better and things are going to change. And by the time they're playing senior football, these conversations won't need to be had as often, or won't need to be had in the same way. But at the moment, we're struggling to see how that's going to happen. So it all just kind of goes back to the same conversation we've been having. But so many things need to change, and it would be naive not to look at the correlation between things like fatigue, mental health, scheduling, ACLs, because it all really is so close together. And I would imagine probably any manager in the WSL or in any league for that matter would probably say the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's all such good points and really important to talk about. So I'm glad we've been able to dig into that a little bit today and give that a bit of time, because I do think it is super important to kind of talk about all these issues, and they do feel very interrelated. So it's kind of hard to separate one from the other. And I guess the natural kind of movement of this conversation would then to go on to solutions. And I think Sean makes a good point here in terms of doing something now is what's needed, because you get more and more commercialized, you get more and more out of the power of anyone that's kind of a stakeholder in that conversation of health and kind of, again, mental health, physical health, and the kind of things surrounded in that debate. And I don't expect any of us to kind of be able to come up with this is the answer, because I don't think we're quite at that level yet. But just in terms of generally having like thoughts on a way forward, I think one of the kind of problems that it arises is you take fixtures away, and that also takes fixtures away from teams. There feels like a big disparity in terms of the amount of fixtures that maybe the top teams in the WSL, for example, would have, or this would be the case in any league. So the top, like Barcelona, would have, to perhaps looking even further down the league or in the Championship in England, and especially this season when there's only 11 teams, you've got maybe the League Cup or the Conti Cup as it was. And if you go out early in kind of cup competitions, you're not actually getting an awful lot of football. So there's this like really tough balancing act that you find between a big disparity. I just wondered, I guess, any thoughts on this and any broader thoughts on like what, if you were given all the keys to women's football, how you would address this going forward. It's a horrible question and really big, but if there's any thoughts on those kind of issues, then yeah, go for it.
It's listening to the players, isn't it? Listening to the people who know, rather than listening to the money. And obviously we're talking about football here, and that is often hard to come by, pardon me. But, you know, there are a lot of smart people in the game. And in terms of the medical side, we need to speak to people who are experts on the medical side of women and women's sport. I think that's really important in terms of not looking at ACLs from a general perspective. They are, you know, sort of different causes for men and women. It's interesting with the scheduling, isn't it? Because you talk about, you know, the top teams who play more games, but then the first two we've seen this season, and then if it's Lundgaard as well, have been for non-Champions League teams who don't play as much football. I think they played one League Cup game so far, and whereas, you know, your Arsenals and your Cities have had to come through qualifiers. Arsenal played 4 qualifiers and straight into it then with 3 league games after those pre-season. Your teams lower down the league in cases will have less international players as well. So it is interesting. And even you look at right at the bottom of the pyramid in terms of your sort of Sunday league players who do their ACLs, who will, you know, play once a week, will have, you know, massive summers where they won't play any football. So it is something where we need to actually speak to the players and say, you know, do you feel comfortable playing in the current circumstances? Do you feel comfortable? You know, again, going back into your mental health, do you worry about ACLs, particularly for players who've done them before? But then those teammates of them, you know, those close friends and teammates, in terms of thinking, actually, if this has happened to them, it can happen to me. And then that then probably affects the way that you actually step out and play on the football pitch. So what we need is cooperation between the governing bodies, discussions between the managers, the players, experts, both within football and within the medical profession, and to work out a better way forward. But unfortunately, that happening at the moment, you know, it doesn't seem as likely as we'd like it to. So we need that sort of, I think it's FIFPro, the union, I guess the PFA on the English side of things. And those unions often don't quite have the impact we'd like them to, probably in football and as compared to other sports, and I guess compared to wider society, if you like, as well. But we need to listen to the people who are affected by this. The fans love having more games. The fans love having these European games, to an extent when they get called off, and to an extent where we're asking too much in terms of scheduling. But the fans don't like their players getting injured, and the fans don't like their players not being happy. And as you say, the standard of football can then suffer as well. So we need to put the players first, and we need to do that the right way.
Yeah, no, really valid points. I think I agree with all of them in terms of that players have to be a priority, and in terms of those voices. We've had a few, I guess, more practical solutions in terms of like these are just put minutes load that can't be exceeded every 2 weeks. I guess like lorry drivers can't exceed it at a certain time. You could do that with footballers, which I'm sure there'll be proponents and opponents of that among the players themselves as well. And then Sean also talking about scrapping the Conti Cup becoming more and more viable option. I think another kind of aspect of that is maybe just a reform of the Conti Cup that kind of Shane hints at here, that maybe the top WSL clubs would want that, although I'm not sure about Arsenal, given it seems to be their only hope of silverware at the moment. But would like lower tier WSL clubs want that? Is there maybe a conversation that the Conti Cup does become for those just out of Europe, and if you're in Europe, you just don't compete in that, or does that maybe devalue the competition? And Sean also mentions that I want to kind of include in this maybe like a reason to not expand the WSL. There's obviously been a lot of talk about how that would be good, increase competition, but it's going to mean more games. Beth, your take on those two questions, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. So I completely agree regarding like not expanding the WSL. Not saying never, but I think you can't expand a league until things are more sustainable, and until issues like this have been, you don't ever get rid of these sorts of problems, I don't think, but until they've been kind of nullified and we've figured out how to deal with them in the best and the safest way for everyone. And with the Conti Cup, or the League Cup now, is it called? But I think definitely we probably will need to see some sort of reform when we keep having these conversations about kind of packed schedules and things. I don't know if like getting rid of it altogether or completely changing it is the right way to go, because I think, especially as you mentioned, when we look at the championship this year only having 11 teams, the Conti Cup is a really big and really important opportunity for championship teams and also WSL teams to get more game time for players who might not in their respective leagues. And also a lot of players, for example, in the championship in particular, don't necessarily go off on international duty. So they're playing even less games. So that's where something like the Conti Cup is so important. But I do completely appreciate the impact of a competition like that on scheduling. And I don't quite have a solution as much as I wish I did. I think it's a conversation to be had. But yes, someone's pointed out, obviously, we also have the FA Cup. So there does come a point in the calendar where it's just completely so jam-packed, and that's where alarm bells start ringing, I think, is when we're only a matter of weeks into the season and we're already needing to have this conversation when really it's barely even started. That's what's a little bit worrying for me, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a really good point. And I guess it kind of speaks to Freddie's point earlier in terms of, I guess we've spoken about, well, ideally, the players would be completely fresh coming into this season and maybe be able to manage this load a little bit more. But we've obviously had kind of, as I spoke about, like different competitions over summers, and you've got players coming off the back of the Olympics, and then you've also got these international tournaments, pre-season tournaments, should I say, in USA, Australia, and you're not going to be like perfectly fresh. Obviously, you need a pre-season, and they're not detrimental in some ways, but that flying is going to take its toll to some extent, especially when that for Arsenal and City that came straight into a Champions League qualification kind of route. Yeah, I think we mainly covered a lot of the points that I kind of wanted to over the course, but do either of you have anything to add to the kind of conversations around, I guess, scheduling or going forward with the Conti Cup? I mean, Sean says need a whole episode to discuss what happens with the Conti Cup, and I certainly think there's so many opinions on that. But if not, we'll kind of, I guess it's a nice way to round it off with just a little bit of a recap of the weekend. We've spoken a lot about kind of English football, and I know Freddie was at a game, and so were you, Beth. So either of you just have, I guess, a highlight from the weekend or a rant from the weekend. And again, in the chat, feel free to put any of your highlights from the weekend in that stood out to you.
You can have the highlight first, because I wasn't able to go down for Arsenal versus Everton, as would be my sort of usual Sunday. I sat through Arsenal-Leicester last weekend, which seemed to be sort of punishment enough, and couldn't get down to the Emirates. So I elected for Sheffield United 2, Bristol City 4. First championship game I've been to in ages, and really, really good. Loads of quality in front of goal. Sort of surprised Bristol City were as low down as they are. They've retained a decent amount of players sort of that they had last season. Jamie Lee Napier was really impressive. They've got a really good sort of front line who've been starting to click. So that was really enjoyable. Sheffield United weren't bad. They just sort of slipped out of the game a little too early. But sort of Lexi Lloyd-Smith, Fionn Morgan, as I say, Napier, Testrup, they've kept, which I think is really important. Maria Ferrugi is a real player for Sheffield United, scored probably the goal of the game that was too little too late. So that was really enjoyable at Bramall Lane as well, proper old sort of English ground. My rant will be that today then I had to sit and watch back Arsenal, already knowing it was a bad game, knowing it was a 0-0 draw, and still having to sit and watch it. So I sort of had the cricket on one screen and that on another, and it was, bad viewing. It was sort of Arsenal at their worst at the moment. And I feel like my worry with Arsenal is that people are not looking forward to watching their games at the moment, whether they be sort of League or Champions League. Like, we've got Bayern Munich on Wednesday, massive. We've got Chelsea on Saturday. We should all be buzzing. We should all be excited, but we're not. And we dread playing the teams lower down the league, which as football fans and as a team who are trying to win the WSL, that shouldn't be a thing. As fans, you should look forward to those games. As well organised as teams like Everton and Leicester are, some of that sort of enjoyment factor has just sort of been sucked out at the moment for Arsenal. And I feel like it's a really, really pivotal week.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that one. But the 4-2 is a lovely score. I always do a thing, I don't know, I think I've said it on this channel before, where I kind of do goals per like pounds per goal. So I work out how much, and obviously probably free for you given you're a press, but in terms of how much I pay for a ticket, work out the value for each goal and whether it's been worth it for pound per goal. And that scores quite highly, I imagine. Yes. But we had I think, Beth, were you at the Tottenham Liverpool game? We've had a bit of discussion in the chat as to the refereeing and the penalty. So your thoughts on that?
Yes, I was there. That was actually going to be one. I kind of have two rants, but that was going to be one of them. It wasn't a penalty for me. Have heard most people say the same. Wasn't a great refereeing performance, and then that just kind of, it wasn't a penalty. I do think that Liverpool were better, so I think that Liverpool probably deserved to win, but it's frustrating for Spurs to lose like that in the final minute. Spoke to Robert Villaham after the game, and he handled it really well. He was very much just kind of like, being a ref is hard, whether it was or wasn't a pen, it is what it is. We need to like learn from the game as a whole and move forward, which I thought was quite an admirable response. But can definitely understand the frustration for Spurs players, Spurs fans with that. Yeah,
absolutely. I feel like refereeing is also another topic that, in especially in the WSL, is another, and women's football generally, it's probably another topic that we can go into a bit more. Elle kind of agreeing there, and it's been atrocious at times. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely something that can maybe talked about another time. I'm sure it will come up, but many times in the season where people have frustrations or are maybe a little bit lucky with a decision. And we've had a few other comments. Shane's agreeing with Freddie in terms of the attendance. I do think that Shane makes the point here that 25,000 plus is great for WSL, and I do think that if you're going to have all your home games there, I think that's still really impressive for a game that's, again, it's not like a blockbuster game by any stretch of the imagination. You're keeping those, and that's numbers of the Premier League. I know we talk about the Emirates in terms of having a capacity of 62,000, I think it is, but you look at a lot of the capacities in terms of the Premier League, and that's a pretty decent crowd for some of those smaller grounds in that league. So I think more than anything that should be celebrated. I know it's a drop off from like the standout crowds, but to be able to, if Arsenal are to maintain that level, I think that should be seen as an achievement. Don't worry, Sean, I'm coming to it, because I do think this is another game for my good value goals per pound. And yeah, so a very good result. I think Brighton are looking super exciting this season, and it'll be really interesting to kind of see how they do, whether they're one of the standouts from that mid-table pack. Any other thoughts, I guess, on any of the WSL games from either of you two before we wrap it off? I've managed to mention Brighton first, Sean, so hopefully I've kept most people happy.
Yeah, I think Brighton look really, really exciting. Had a great window, great new manager. So yeah, enjoying watching them play. There you go, Sean. I hope that's made your evening. And yeah, being at the Spurs Liverpool game, my other kind of rant was just gutting seeing Sophie Lingard go down with what looked like another not so great knee injury. I know Matt Beard was quite worried about it afterwards. So yeah, and I just think, touching back on kind of what we were saying before, it's almost like, do we need to just look, is there a model somewhere in the world that is working and not having these issues, or getting close to it? Because if there is, we need to kind of take a leaf out of their book. But anyway, I think across the WSL and the Championship, there's loads of goals. So that's always nice, and some really great goals as well. So yeah, that's definitely a highlight. But there's some not so exciting football being played from the likes of Arsenal and not Everton, sorry, Man City. Arsenal played Everton. But some great football being played, I think, by teams like Brighton. So yeah, all in all, there's just a lot to talk about, really.
Can I shout out Crystal Palace quickly as well, bouncing back from that 7-0 defeat for Chelsea? I thought in time, there at times at Selhurst Park, they looked a proper team. And, we know Chelsea can do that to anyone. They've got that attacking firepower. Leicester were good against Arsenal, deserved a point, and Palace have gone there and turned them over. Annabelle Blanchard scoring. The first goal, beautiful, like little bit of link-up football. I think it was the first goal anyway, sort of catching up on that this morning. I think they're going to give a few teams a run for their money. I don't think they're going to, I think a lot of people will rightly have them on to go straight back down, but I don't think they're going to do a Bristol City. I mean, Bristol City only won once last season, I think, and Palace are already off the mark. And I think that's a really good sign for them. They've got a lot of new players, a lot of gelling to do, but I've got a little soft spot for them, I think, because they're trying to play football the right way, and I think they are going to cause a few teams some problems. Yeah,
and a good reminder from Sean that there is that. Is it the A34 derby? Have I got the road right, Sean? I'm not sure. There's
is it M24?
M24. I'm completely off the mark there. Got the letter and the number wrong. Yeah. I'm not from the south, so my road knowledge around there is not the one. But yes, the M24 derby, we'll go with that, is on next weekend for the first time in women's football. So that will be a really, really interesting match to kind of see how that one goes, because Crystal Palace have looked pretty decent against, obviously, we don't call it a derby. Yeah, I guess it's quite a geographical distance, but it is up there with one of those made up derbies that everyone likes to add a bit more excitement into the league. But we will wrap it up there. There's obviously so much more we could talk about from the weekend's action, but we sadly don't have too much longer left. But to wrap it off, Freddie, where can we find your work if people want to follow you outside of this podcast?
I'm really pleased you asked, actually, because you are writing for our next Arsenal women only online Guna fanzine. So head over to Guna fanzine on Twitter, our website as well. That we are hoping will be up before Saturday's game against Chelsea. It's the only fanzine dedicated all to Arsenal women. We've got a really, really exciting team of writers. I've got an exclusive interview on there with Joe Churchman, who played for Arsenal in the 90s under Vic Akers. A load of really, really good stories from Joe. Really proud of what we've done, our team of writers, and the front cover as well is really cool. I've had that sent over to me today. So I'm at Cardy Freddie on Twitter. And if women's football, if fanzines and Arsenal, of course, are your thing. But I hope there's a lot as well for non-Arsenal fans in there as well. But we're really excited to have that out later this week. It's online and it's free of charge as well. So keep an eye out for that.
And Beth, for you, where can we find you?
Thank you for having me. You can find me on Twitter at Beth R. McCowen, and most of my work is on the halfway line covering the Championship and the WSL.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I've really enjoyed some of the discussion that's gone on in the chat and that we've been able to have tonight. So, yeah, really appreciate it. And obviously keep an eye out for future shows on the All for Wofo Twitter and I guess just the YouTube. Make sure you're subscribing and you've liked this video because it does really, really help us. So yeah, and we'll definitely be back next Monday. I'm not sure if we've got anything kind of midweek. And you can tell I'm filling time while I find the outro, but we will see you next week on Monday.